Welcome back to our read on contemporary society, and specifically the primary institutions of the arts, music, and communication. This is video 6F Part 7, which focuses on the communication platforms embedded in the mega media corporations. In this part, we will principally cover the research and analysis that is showing our communication companies are heavily biased to the left liberal side, and against right conservative sentiments. We will also refresh everyone on the nature of moral relativity, especially as it manifests in the communication platform and culture. And we will begin by examining the state of our print communications. Let's begin by asking a simple yet relevant question. Do you think that there's an ideological bias in different professions in America? The question has significance because if certain professions are ideologically biased, they can be overly influential in our culture in advocating and pushing their ideology onto an unsuspecting people and children in our society. Now, whenever there is actual research available that establishes a factual basis for critically analyzing a question like this, it's invaluable to refer to that analysis in order to speak competently and reliably on the subject, when you can refer to the facts as opposed to subjective, unsupported, opinion-based commentary. You get to the truth of a matter. Fortunately, on this question, there was good factual research completed, and we will refer to it in our discussion. Well, one company called CrowdPack researched this very question, and we would like to share with you what they found. CrowdPack, by the way, is a nonpartisan firm dedicated to political data analysis, so any skepticism about bias in their findings should be calmed. Business Insider reported out CrowdPack's research findings in an article in November 2013. Andy Kaiser and Hunter Walker authored the piece. Drawing data from federal records on campaign contributions by people dating back to the 1980s, CrowdPack was able to estimate where various officials and donors fall on the political spectrum, scoring individual donors as being more liberal or conservative based upon what kind of candidates they gave to. Here's what CrowdPack found. Those professions which are decidedly liberal in attitude and politics are on the left side, indicating that they contributed heavily to liberal political politicians and causes. Those professions which contributed to conservative political positions map to the right side. What's most fascinating is which groups track left and liberal. It's in these left-leaning professions where society draws its principal communications and learnings from. We see the entertainment industry coming up the most liberal. On the chart to the right, you can see how demonstrably liberal the group is, based on donor count by ideological candidate. Closely followed by the academic community. Again, look to the right, showing a very liberal group, decidedly liberal in fact. Next is online computer services, which is the tech industry, inclusive of the internet professionals. We find them in the third most liberal position for any profession, and we see the internet infrastructure as a key part of the sprawling mega media empires, which owns various internet companies for developing and distributing internet programs and content. In fourth, we see the newspapers and print media are fully on the liberal side of the ideological spectrum. Not a surprise with that. If the research was even more current, we'd probably find this profession even more to the left side, especially if they included the major mainstream news networks like NBC, CNN, CBS, and ABC. Now let's look at the right side of the chart, where the professions which tend to be more conservative can be found. A couple of points to take note of here. First, all the professions come from what you would categorize as mainly infrastructure industry: mining, agriculture, building and construction, oil and gas. In these professions, it's always been a bulwark of ideological conservatism in the nation. Second, none of the conservative professions are too far to the right. They're more inclined towards the center, in contrast to what you see depicted in the professions on the liberal side, which are more positioned comparatively to the deeper side of the left, indicating quite clearly a strong identity with liberal values amongst those professions which donate to liberal candidates, as opposed to the more moderate conservative professions on the right side. Another finding we see here is that the professions which are largely indicating a liberal progressive tone in their politics, as well as their policy preferences, tend to be in professions which can deeply impact the primary institutions in our culture, like social, legal, civic, academia, communications, music, Hollywood, and leadership. These institutions are heavily influential in organizations which communicate and set in motion social policy. And we would say, from a societal and cultural impact, these professions and aligning companies have much more weight and impact upon the development and influence to the nation's belief on social and moral issues, and in contrast to business and industry. Our last conclusion we draw from this research is simple but important. We have linked a fairly direct relationship between moral relativity and liberal progressivism, as we see how one begets the other. We have spoken a good deal about how moral relativity is a flawed moral philosophy, leading to many of society's ills, and how it underwrites modern-day liberal progressivism in ideology and politics. It's both alarming and yet affirming to what we've been saying throughout our review of contemporary society and the primary institutional groups, and how we've seen these primary institutions damaged by both moral relativity and the liberalism you see indicated on the left side of the chart. Based on the research we just went through, courtesy from the Crowdpack study, we can more clearly see how real facts back up what we've been saying about the arts, music, and communication industries so far. These institutions are manifestly liberal and progressive by nature, largely driven by the predominant professions which work in these industries. The communication industry itself is a very key backbone for the arts, music, and mega media corporations, providing the crucial backbone infrastructure for all of them and their subsidiaries. A technical and professional infrastructure to deliver their content to the public and in turn dramatically influence our culture. In the communication industries, we know with confidence, backed up by good research, a majority of the professions in the entertainment, online technology, news, and print media industries are dominated by liberal progressives, many of whom would be clearly classified as moral relativists in ideology and belief. And we have previously made the strong link between the underlying moral philosophy of relativism and the ideology commonly identified today as liberal progressivism, both of which, many if not most times, promote activities and policies which are harmful to good and moral values in our culture, reflecting a vanity which rejects the supremacy of God and morality in culture, and instead embraces the anarchy of the unrestricted human ego. Once again, as we've seen in the other primary institutions of society, we see the hands of liberal relative moralists, focused and rapidly devoted to their social engineering of our society, the relentless effort to reach and influence people with their ideology of political left-wing liberalism. Many social scientists would call that social engineering of the progressive moral relativists the clever manipulation of the natural human tendency to trust in other people or in organizations and in corporations. And others would go one observation further, in asserting it's not just about some general manipulation without purpose. It's something more, much more. It's about manipulation with a specific end in mind. It's about a moral relativist agenda and objective which they intently pursue. Their objective is about deceiving trusting souls in our society at large. To moral relativists, it's about misleading and entrapping people into their agenda and, keeping them there. We saw it happening in the arts, in Hollywood, and in music, and now we're also going to see it very distinctly in the print and electronic communication industries. But before we move forward into this video narrative, let's take a moment and refresh ourselves on what moral relativism is all about. Knowing what moral relativism is includes knowing what names they go by, and where, when, and how they intersect your life. When somebody proclaims they're a secularist, an atheist, an agnostic, and today, more frequently, a progressive liberal, take notice, as you're in the company of a moral relativist, whether they admit it or not, whether they understand what they are or not. Moral relativism has a target. It wants something from us, and it's highly active in its pursuit. We can't say it enough. Moral relativism has a target. They're after our children, first and foremost. They're also after us, you and me, everyone you know. And if we get in their way as they pursue our children, they will aggressively undermine us through control that they have on our surrounding culture and all the primary institutions they've heavily influenced. Know quite clearly, they will knowingly do what they will in order to get what they want. Moral relativism also has a creed. What it stands for and stands against. What it requires its adherents to believe in or not believe in. We previously shared with you in video narrative number 4 a definition of morality as it principally exists in the world today. A definition which explained the essential difference between absolute morality on the one hand with relative morality on the other. In moral philosophy, absent of any morality at all, one of these two principal moralities prevail in people's hearts, and they are vastly different from one another, and they are entirely central to our contemporary review of culture's principal institutions, especially in communications. These moralities are actively engaged in our culture and society as a source of influence and energy which determines the ultimate character of humanity over time. Absolute morality, we explained, is a morality of and from God, which accepts and believes in God at its center as a supreme deity, a one and single God of love, above and sovereign to humanity in every way. And through a love of humankind, he established foundational values, each reflecting essential truths to honor and live by, and specifically as a guide to develop humankind towards eternal life. And then there is relative morality, which does not accept a supreme God, and by consequence does not accept supreme truths and values over humanity, but instead pushes God out and supplants God with man's intellect and ego alone, making man the center to determine the nature of morality for humanity and not God. In the creed of moral relativism, man alone determines morality, relative to his opinion and intellect, relative to the time, the place, and circumstance, relative to political ideology and personal bias, relative to his power, and relative only to his self-appeal. Let's be reminded of moral relativism's true nature. It's not of God, as it rejects the notion of a supreme deity. Instead, it is a creed which centers on man and man's vanity alone. It's not from goodness, but from the mindless depths of empty human souls. It is relentless, cruel, and angry, and it seeks control over innocence and trusting lives, control through deception and lies. Moral relativism has an agenda, and it's not a good one. It seeks to remove God from our lives, and to both dominate and control us through our culture and surrounding society. The agenda is to loosen the glue of society and displace God-centered truths which generate the cohesion and civility of society itself, and replace it with the quixotic relative reasoning of man, absent of soul and heart, absent of God's inspiration. Closely considered, it is the ultimate aim of moral relativity to push God out and ascend man in God's place. And rather than the absolute principle shaping and guiding humanity, we get individuals and their power-hungry egos selecting for themselves what has or should have relative priority for people. And followed to its endgame, we get struggle, conflict, anarchy, and eventually death. Moral relativity's agenda is simple. The relativist seeks to divert humankind's choice and behavior not towards God, but to the alluring attractions and pleasures of the body and mind. Things, be them material or conceptual, which appeals to the body's desire and the human ego. Moral relativity elevates and glorifies these things in human society, things which often lead to devastating addictions or depression, and ultimately much worse. This agenda is closely supported and encouraged by people who know what they're doing. We all need to clearly realize the relativists will not give up until they get the innocents hooked, until the child or youth or adult before you does not know where to turn, what to do, or where to go. When relative morality prevails over God-centered values, it invariably devolves a culture into anarchy, undermining absolute values with relative opinions, cheap principles, and often anti-values, leading people into a homelessness of both mind and heart. The relativist intent is disruption and prevention of good values from having a guiding influence within the primary institutions of society and in turn people's lives. Such is the ambition of the moral relativists, and sadly to say, many progressive liberals today. Moral relativism has tactics it employs to get what it wants. Being able to identify them is to be forearmed. The moral relativists will knowingly distort our children's mind with enticements and imagery, in a deliberate effort to pull them away from their beliefs, to divide them from what they've learned from their parents, their family, from their heritage and tradition. Beliefs regarding good moral behavior based on foundational values and faith in God. And if left unchallenged, the progressive relativist will supplant the child's beliefs with an empty, misleading creed, leading into entrapment and death. The nature of moral relativity can be summarized in 4 short tactics. First, it always seeks to undermine competition, and will use the tactics of ridicule, distortion, overwhelming lies, and intimidation. Second, it will often create a relentless message, typically a lie, and communicate that lie through as many mediums of communication it can control, telling the lie again and again until they are believed. Third, it will strategically target control over the next generation, focused on the children, and effect change through them until a sought political and amoral control is eventually achieved. And fourth, it seeks to create a sustaining dependency, as we see in the dark dependencies of drugs, alcohol, sex, resistance, and gangs. Or, as we see in the entitlements of government and the weakening of social, normative controls throughout society. In the communications industry of print, TV, cable, internet, and radio, moral relativists assert tactics to gain principal control and influence over the content and messaging, so they can leverage the communication mediums to their full advantage, to as many people as they can reach within our society, and as often as they can. In their efforts, they count on one key thing: the listener hasn't developed critical analysis in their thinking. And unfortunately, for the most part, they frequently achieve this end, as many adults, youth, and children have not developed the ability to think critically in their lives. In fact, many of our schools, from middle schools right up through college programs, are no longer effectively developing critical thinking skills in students, mainly due to the suffocating impacts of liberal progressive education we find occurring today, which has relaxed standards for academic discipline and rigor, replacing quality principles of education with politically correct nonsense, adventurism and social justice, and ideological bias. Combine the lack of critical analysis with an open and trusting nature, people are easily manipulated today, and the liberal relativists know this, and they actively exploit this vulnerability in our society to their own selfish aims. Once moral relativism has its way on a mind, the way forward in life of that person is invariably confused, often desperate and dark. The toxin of moral relativism is rapidly infecting people of all ages throughout society, regardless of income, social level, or education. This is something that is happening right now to our children, our youth, families, and friends. This is a fact, a cultural war, being waged directly against you and your loved ones, and it's occurring whether we understand it or not, whether we want to believe it or not, whether we're able to fight it or not. It's happening. Altogether, this makes the innocents in our society easy targets of relativist deceptions and lies, and with their majority control of the communication industries, they're able to distribute and amplify their message many times over in multiple formats across the nation. On TV, the cable networks, radio, print media, and the internet every hour of the day. It represents an extraordinary, invasive reach into our homes and lives, and what is quite concerning is we have little control over much of it. As an example, in print communications we become accustomed to the teen magazines which have been printed for about 40 years now, heavily promoting body image, materialism, heartthrobs, shallow relationships, and of course, sex. And the print companies behind these magazines continue an unabated exploitation of American youth, of their innocence and trusting minds, of their vulnerability to puberty and raging hormones. Now we see the same print companies shifting the communication platform from hard copy print magazines to internet, web, and social media sites. And because of the ubiquity of the digital internet, the reach into our children's lives by these purveyors is rapidly expanding. In print magazines, we also see a blatant effort to sexualize many topics directed toward young adult readers. Rolling Stone magazine projecting the Boston bomber as a handsome sex symbol. For their editorial staff, there is no shame in glorifying a demented murderer of innocent American citizens. Or for the Rolling Stones to have a young boy band posed naked and sexual to stimulate the illusion of sex and music. Entertainment Weekly doing the same thing, only with young women. It's simple trickery, architected by people with low or no respect for women or men, aimed at young minds in vulnerable periods of their lives, and it's wrong. In many other periodicals, we see the continued negative attitude towards Christians. Why would Rolling Stone magazine depict Kanye West as a tortured Christ-like figure, bloodied with a crown of thorns on his head and a tattered smock? The association of West with the image of Jesus Christ is hardly a fitting comparison. West, a materialistic, drug-abusing, indulgent, and ego-driven persona, is no way a morally equivalent comparison to Christ. Even the mere suggestion that Kanye West is being tortured, like Christ was, is a monstrously inappropriate comparison, if not delusional. And most emphatically, it's false and insulting to millions of American Christians. Or why does Gentleman's Quarterly, GQ, feature Tim Tebow in a center story and on its cover, headlined with a mocking opener, "Brothers, have you accepted Tim Tebow as your Sunday Savior?" Deceitfully phrased with dual meaning, are they referring to Sunday football or Tim Tebow's strong Christian stance? Of course, GQ is attempting to marginalize the man for his faith, and inside they have him shirtless, arms outstretched side to side, in a crude suggestive pose meant to mimic Christ on the cross, hitting his image with a deriding comment on his moral standards regarding sex before marriage, as though he's a broken man for having standards, and slanderously hinting at homosexuality, the same magazine which in other editions increasingly champions transsexuals and homosexuality. Then we have some periodicals taking an undermining approach to Christianity, like Time magazine, Newsweek, and Maclean's, each one focusing their story about Jesus Christ not in a manner which supports or credits the love and teachings he brought to humanity, not to honor his human sacrifice for humanity, but instead to dishonor it, with misleading articles to seed doubt and skepticism in the reader about the Bible, about the man Jesus, and by connection, the authenticity of the Christian faith itself. Time puts out a negative story intended to seed doubt about the Gospels, giving exposure and credibility to Christian debunkers. Or Newsweek in their cover story aimed at impugning people who read and interpret the Bible in their congregations and study groups, suggesting as though somehow they're off base. And then we get Maclean's, directly seeding doubt on the question whether Christ actually existed, despite indisputable historical records. All three of these national and wide-read publications are principally negative and marginalizing to Christianity, reflecting a decided bias against the great world faith, a bias these magazines don't repeat against Islam, Judaism, Hindu, or Buddhist religions, just Christianity. And then there's the social engineering of the gay transgender agenda in America. Many magazines, rather than holding to a neutral position of reporting both sides to an issue, lean completely to the left liberal viewpoint, actually becoming advocates for the liberal position. And as a result, America gets something slanted. Rather than getting intelligent, thoughtful discussions on the subjects to educate, inform, and develop critical analysis, we get an emotional spin job, advocacy, social engineering, all ingenuously disguised as real news. Here's some examples of how some major national magazines have engaged in taking an advocacy position for the LGBTQ agenda. The point here is not one of taking sides, but rather argue for the objectivity of news and comment, to inform the reader, not brainwash them. Half of America has a different viewpoint of this issue of homosexuality and the growing issue of genderism. Never will you find the opposite conservative viewpoint represented on any of these magazine covers. The omission is one of intentful, liberal bias, contrived to ignore and suffocate opposing views, not a practice conducive to free market of ideas and speech. A huge issue in American media communications today is one of division, a polarizing division of both political ideology and base moral philosophy, occurring within the thousands of companies comprising modern media communications in our nation. The opposing sides in this division are distinct, entrenched, and convicted towards their respective ideology and morality. On one side are those media communication companies which subscribe to left liberal political ideology, underwritten by a progressive relative morality. And on the other side are the media companies which subscribe to a right conservative political ideology, underwritten with a foundational absolute morality. Most media communication companies are either on one side of the division or the other, either to the left and liberal relative, or to the right conservative and absolute. There are some companies which fall into a neutral-centric position, and unfortunately the gulf between the two sides is widening. Let's take a look at an interesting graphic. No, it's not this one. We'll show it in a few minutes, but I'll warn you first, it's quite an eye chart. However, it shows us an accurate reflection of the ideological landscape of the bigger media communication companies across the country. The graphic is sourced from CherylAtkinson.com. Cheryl is a 5-time Emmy Award winner and recipient of the Edward R. Burrell Award for Investigative Reporting. Cheryl is an expert on news media in the U.S., having led over 30 years a very distinguished career at CBS News, PBS, CNN, and local newses. She is also an author of the book The Smear, released in the spring of 2017, and the New York Times bestseller Stonewalled. This graphic is a rare look at how national media and news organizations fall on a line of ideological disposition. You can see how various communication companies across our national media spectrum, inclusive of newspaper print, electronic TV and cable networks, magazines, and internet-based news brands, each position on a general scale of political ideology. In the center, indicated by a broken green line, is the middle, or most balanced, neutral ideological position to be in. In blue to the left, we find the left liberal communication companies and brands, and then to the right, we see positioned those communication companies which are generally right conservative. One striking observation is the heavier weight of communication companies on the left liberal side, with a greater intensity on the scale to the left, than what we see on the right conservative side, where there are fewer companies and less overall reach compared to the left. We'll refer to more specifics on this chart in the next video presentation. However, if nothing else, this chart demonstrates a fairly significant division we have in American media, from both a political ideological perspective and by the underwriting moral philosophy which fuels the values and beliefs in the respective political parties. This concludes video narrative 6F Part 7 on the primary institutions of the arts, music, and communications. Please continue on to video 6F Part 8, where we will continue examining the communication industries in our contemporary culture.